I think the United States is going through a period of self-doubt, a period in which American society is increasingly factionalized, divided, polarized, and has become less confident and less trusting. And the combination of troubles at home with the rise of China, the kind of challenge that it poses, and the new distribution of power in the world means that the United States is groping for a new foreign policy strategy, a new path.
Welcome back to the Global Gambit. We're back to discuss the war in Iran, but after the intense exchanges and general skirmishes, you could say, the escalations that we saw over the past few days between the Iranians and the Americans, we're in a relatively lull period as we wait to see whether there may be any progress towards peace talks. And with that in mind, I thought it was worth taking stock of the broader strategic direction of things and how it interplays with the war in Ukraine, how it interplays with the relationship of the US to China, grand strategy. And considering everything about grand strategy, there's someone particular that I thought would be great to speak to, which is George Beebe, the director of grand strategy program at the Quincy Institute, an organization that we've had a few people on now, and it's great to have George with us as well. So, George, welcome. I'm very interested to see what your perspective is on this from a sort of big picture, macro view lens. How do you look at what the American grand strategy has been towards Iran and vice versa?
Well, I'll start by thanking you for having me on. Appreciate the invitation. And I'll also sketch a big picture, if you'll indulge me for a second here, because I think it's important to understand the context in which current events are happening, in which the Trump administration is attempting to chart a new foreign policy course for the United States. So during the Cold War, the world was a bipolar order. We had the East Bloc led by the Soviet Union, the Western Bloc, so-called, led by the United States, and there was a competition that went on that had military and ideological components to it. Largely was not economic. The Soviet Union was not really a commercial economic power, and with the exception of some areas of military technology, wasn't really a technological rival of the United States, and was largely autarkic. It was not integrated into the global economy, and certainly not into the Western economy. With the end of the Cold War, we entered a unipolar era in the global order, where the United States had unmatched political influence, economic might, military power, and the other countries in the world couldn't even begin to approach that power. And the United States, I think, asked itself, okay, what do we do? We're in a unique situation. What kind of foreign policy should we really pursue? And I think the answer we came to after a little bit of toing and froing was, well, let's remake the world in our image. Approach states that used to be in that old Soviet bloc, and let's help Westernize them. Let's reform them. And in so doing, bring them into the Western world, integrate them into NATO, integrate them into the EU. And while we're at it, let's look at these backward states, extremist, unstable states in the greater Middle East, which after 9/11 were posing a considerable problem to U.S. security. Let's transform them too. The answer to the challenge of global terrorism, we thought, was let's reform, let's socially re-engineer these countries and make them like us, and problem will go away. And with China, I think we thought, well, we'll integrate China economically into this globalized international economic order. And that will lift all boats in the world, make China more prosperous, create a Chinese middle class. And in so doing, that middle class within China will demand liberalization, westernization, democratization of China, and that will produce stability. Well, that phase of American foreign policy And that period of global order has ended. We're not in that unipolar world any longer. We're now in an emerging multipolar order, a much more polycentric distribution of power in the world. The United States does have a peer rival in China. And this is a challenge that the United States has never faced before in its history. The Soviet Union was a military peer. It was not an economic peer. And it was not integrated into the world economy. China is an economic peer. When you look at purchasing power parity as a measure of GDP, the Chinese economy is larger than that of the United States. And it is deeply integrated into the global economy and deeply integrated into the American economy. There's an intertwining of supply chains there, which means that containing China in the way that we tried to contain the Soviet Union militarily and ideologically during the Cold War period really isn't a viable strategy for today. We have to come up with something else. And while this is going on, I think the United States is going through a period of self-doubt, a period in which American society is increasingly factionalized, divided, polarized, and has become less confident and less trusting. And the combination of troubles at home with the rise of China, the kind of challenge that it poses, and the new distribution of power in the world means that the United States is groping for a new foreign policy strategy, a new path. And I think you see this reflected in what the Trump administration produced a few months ago in its national security strategy. I would argue that for the first time since the Cold War period, we actually have a strategy. And by that, I mean an effort to reconcile ends and means, our goals and our resources and abilities to achieve those goals. During the unipolar period, we didn't think we had to reconcile ends and means because the disparity between our capabilities and power and everybody else was so great. We got overambitious during that time. We tried to do things we couldn't do. But now we're in a period where we have new demands. Now that's where Iran, China, Russia, Europe, Ukraine all come into this picture. Because
but how much could that be a reflection of the American public's and policymakers' decision? China has risen, but America hasn't necessarily declined. There's a debate around whether it's the relativism of China's rise versus America's just simply plateauing or decline. Moreover, I would say that, we can argue about multipolarity, but some people argue that it's inherently unstable and therefore there grows a natural towards bipolar world, the Chinese bloc and the American bloc. Other people argue, maybe like Ian Bremmer or such, that there is no pole. The American pole is stronger, but it's not a hyperpower anymore. And the Chinese pole, depending upon whether you see it as a status quo power or a country that wants to take over the hegemonic status, varies. So how do you interpret those sorts of different arguments?
Well, I think these are all relative judgments. You can argue whether something qualifies as a pole or not. And what a pole does is it attracts and repels, right? That's how magnetic poles work. And you can argue the degree to which the Chinese attract, to which the American pole attracts. Are the Russians a pole? Do they have any power of attraction on all of this or not? I don't think there's any question, however, that the distribution of power in the world has changed. And there's a relative decline in American power versus that of other countries. Not just China, but medium powers have more clout. They have more room for maneuver. They can play off different powers against one another in ways that they really couldn't during the unipolar period. You could try to defy the United States and hedge against its power. You could bandwagon with the United States during that unipolar period, but there really wasn't another pole that you could align with on this. That's no longer true. And you're seeing this today in changed behavior on the part of Turkey and Saudi Arabia and India and others. They've got more freedom of maneuver than they used to have. And just one small indication of this, the reconciliation, which now looks like a relatively brief one between Saudi Arabia and Iran a couple of years ago, it was one that didn't involve the United States at all. In fact, those two countries approached China and asked for Chinese help in achieving a normalization of relations. And they didn't even ask the United States or inform the United States until after they announced that they had made a qualitative breakthrough in that bilateral relationship. One couldn't have imagined that kind of thing during the unipolar era. And I think it's emblematic of changes that have occurred in the world. Now, is this multipolar polycentric distribution of power stable or unstable? Is it enduring or not? Will it inevitably lead to conflict? Those are academic debates. I'm not sure that you're going to get a definitive answer to that question. Life itself is going to provide an answer to that, I think, one way or the other.
Yeah, no, certainly. I think it's just interesting because some people argue that during the Cold War, and maybe it was because of the emergence of MAD and nuclear weapons, but the idea of a multipolarity is actually more concerning because it galvanizes more countries to be protective or powerful enough to protect their own interests. I mean, look at the UAE deciding to leave OPEC. Look at the European Union trying to exert its influence more, especially with the sort of the lock of Hungary being removed. And certainly Brazil and other basically smaller alliance groups or regional blocs trying to work collectively together to exercise their interests. So I'm curious, when we think about multipolarity, I think it's primarily from a nation state standpoint. The nation states are the primary ways that communities, societies express themselves. But seemingly we have a growing role of minilateral groups, multilateralism in the biggest sense, like UN and stuff, I think is being diluted. But do you think you can see more countries leveraging alliances as a way to bandwagon, as you say, or to burden share or something like that?
Well, it's possible. I think we see lots of different nascent trends right now, and that's a reflection of uncertainty. We are entering into this new order. States are trying to understand it and to reckon with it and determine how to navigate in this new set of circumstances. So I think they're going to try a lot of things and see what works. Understand clearly that the old order is coming to a close, and that means the old rules and the old institutions that were adapted for that period are going to fade away, either gradually or abruptly. It depends on circumstances and the particulars of each of these structures and organizations. But things are changing. And when things change, people try some things and see what works. So I don't think we can, with any confidence, predict what the outlines of these new approaches are going to be. But I think we can say with a fair amount of confidence that it's not going to look like it has looked. The things that have been familiar are going to go away. And for a country like the United States, which was at the top of this pyramid during the unipolar period, that's alarming because we liked the old order. We were comfortable with it. And the unfamiliarity of being in a position where you have a different kind of challenge in a much more complex world. And there's no question that multipolarity brings complexity. Unipolarity is simple. Even bipolarity is relatively simple. Are you on our side or aren't you? But multipolarity is complex. It's difficult to predict. There's lots of different things that can happen. And I think that makes people uncomfortable and it makes some people fearful. And that itself, that fear, brings an element into this, which makes things, I think, more volatile and unpredictable than they might otherwise be.
Certainly, and I think what the past 30 years, or shorter perhaps, 2025, a lot of people point to the 2008 financial crisis. You could go far back as the Iraq War. There have been inflection points which began to undermine the primacy of the United States over the past 30 years, but certainly the past 30 years has been the exception, not the rule. It seems to be that we're going back to more of this inherent instability and what we got used to, or at least people of my generation. I'm younger than the whole period has largely existed, right? So it's what's defined my education, my outlook, my expectations, assumptions in many ways. When we look at what multipolarity in this regard means to you, then, George, is it a return to certain features that we can look back at historically, or is this a new version that is completely unpredictable because of like technology, globalization, and so on?
I think it is a new version. I mean, certainly the past can teach us some lessons. My inclination would be to reach back to, the period of the concert of Europe and imagine how a multipolar system during that period was managed. And I think it was managed relatively well. It took an awful lot of failure and blood to get to that point, but it did work for that period of time when it was really the system in Europe until it failed. And it failed quite spectacularly in World War I. For reasons that we could devote a whole program to, but it is tempting to look back at that and say, gee, could that work today? I would argue, though, that the system that we're talking about today is far more complex, a lot more variables. Technology has changed things. It has brought speed. It has brought, instant communications. It is brought I don't know if you want to call it a democratization of the media environment, but it has allowed everybody a megaphone to broadcast opinions and takes on the news and post things that can affect perceptions and make it complex to keep order and manage crises and find ways to establish stability and settle conflicts and all of that. So I think it's a much more complex world, technology much more dynamic. We're now bringing space into this in ways that are far beyond what the case was during the Cold War period. So in a lot of ways, this is a formidable challenge to statesmen of today. I don't think we have a neat blueprint for how you do this. We're going to have to make a lot of this up as we go along. And that, I think, means there's going to be some trials and errors. And hopefully these errors don't prove to be disastrous errors.
So a few years ago, French President Macron went to China with von der Leyen, the EU commissioner. And it was quite notable because it was the first time that it looked like Europe was really trying to branch out of the US shadow, or at least try to exercise a bit more of that strategic autonomy. Now, obviously, it's become a lot more of a pertinent phrase and sort of set of thinking amongst people because of what Trump's been doing and saying over Europe. But the bottom line is that she also emphasized quite explicitly at the time that he would welcome the idea of a tripolar world, or another bloc in the form of Europe to counterweight against the Chinese and the Americans in this strategic competition. Now, you can focus on Europe if you like, but I'm just kind of curious how you see that kind of idea, that another pole, be that the Europeans or a broader EU, Canada, Australia, Mark Carney emphasized middle powers. Do you see such a sort of construction possible?
Well, I'm a little bit of a Kissingerian when it comes to this question, in that I think the great powers are the ones that are the fundamental architecture of world order. Achieving a stability among the great powers is task number one for world order. The middle powers matter, certainly, but if you don't get the great power relationships right, the middle powers aren't going to help you really a whole lot. And I also think that it's in America's interest for Europe to be one of the poles in this emerging multipolar architecture, one of those great powers. I think Russia has to be. Now, clearly the United States, should it not completely subvert its own interest is going to be one of these poles. China will be as well. Russia and Europe are question marks. They have the potential to be significant players in the world. They're not going to be, I don't think, at the level of the United States and China. And I don't think you have to have a uniform distribution of power among the great powers for the system to be multipolar. But I think that the challenge that Europe faces right now is that it is not ready to be a great power. It's not ready for a lot of strategic autonomy. I think the United States can't afford in this new order to continue to have Europe be a strategic dependency of the United States, one where Europe outsources its security to the United States, focuses on economic growth and the kinds of things that the EU has focused on, but really relies on the United States to be the security umbrella for Europe. We can't do that in a situation where China poses the kinds of challenges that it does for the United States. We have to be able to tell the Europeans, guess what? You're going to have to provide a lot more for your own self-defense. Europe also has to get stronger and more resilient. And a lot of people, when they hear that, they think, well, Europe has to increase its defense spending. It needs a much more capable military. My answer to that is, yeah, that is an element of what Europe needs to do. But I'm not even sure it's the most important element. I think Europe has to become more dynamic, more resilient, more self-confident, because to be a player, a pole, to help counterbalance other poles in this emerging multipolar order, and to do so in a stable way, you have to have confidence in yourself. You have to understand who you are and believe in yourself. Europe doesn't do that right now. And not a lot of people want to talk about that. But I think to some degree, Europeans have lost their way, their bearings. And that has to be restored. And that's sort of an emotional and psychological thing, but it matters a lot.
But is that out of insecurity or complacency? Because I think that a large proportion of criticism that is due is over the free riding. One of the few things I will agree with Donald Trump on is that the Europeans for too long have ridden on the back of the United States in terms of defense. But I don't think that we should be dependent on any great power or big power. You know, the Russians for cheap energy, the Americans for security assurances, and the Chinese for big markets. I don't think that's wise for any of us, but there seems to be an incessant, almost unwillingness amongst Europeans to recognize that times are changing and that we need to shift away some of our focus from welfare towards, just an example, defense spending. And to your point, a broader attitude adjustment. But as I say, is the underlying driver of that a sense of inertia or a sense of insecurity?
Well, I think it's a sense of purpose, actually. You know, any country, any nation is not just an arrangement for raising the standard of living for its citizens. It has to be something more than that. Without that, it's very antiseptic. It doesn't actually help human beings aspire to things that really matter to them. If my goal in life is to get a bigger apartment, that's not something that people are inspired by, really. It's not something that really, at the heart of things, creates a nation. And Europe, I think, once had a pretty clear sense of what its purpose was. And it doesn't anymore. I mean, the purpose in the post-Cold War period was to deepen the integration among European nations and broaden the membership of the EU, to bring in more of Europe, to unite Europe, to create this bigger entity, more deeply integrated, to imbue these member states with European values. I think they've lost sense of what those values are, and the deepening and broadening projects in Europe can't continue anymore. They've reached their limits, I think. And so Europe has to figure out, what are we doing? Why? What's our purpose? That to me is a part of being a great power in this emerging great power order. And that's not something the United States can do for Europe. The Europeans have to find their own way on that. And they're doing so at a time of significant demographic change. There's no question about it. The Europe of 2026 doesn't look very much like the Europe of 1996 demographically. There are big changes there. They have big implications for what Europe is about and how it governs itself. And these are things that Europe has to wrestle with too. Now, I think the United States wants Europe to figure out these questions, wants Europe to regain its mojo, so to speak, and step up and be a real player in this multinational order. Now, part of that is having the self-confidence to engage diplomatically with Russia. And right now, Europe doesn't have it. So that's a part of this insecurity part of this that you asked about. Any kind of stability, I think, among great powers has to involve a combination of diplomacy and deterrence, power and understandings about what's in bounds and what's out of bounds. Now, to engage diplomatically with another great power like Russia, you need some self-confidence. You need the ability to think that engagement won't inevitably redound to the advantage of the other side and disadvantage you. And right now, I think Europe is scared. It is not self-confident enough to engage diplomatically with Russia. I think that's a problem. So we need Europe to be both militarily more capable, but also resilient enough and self-confident enough to engage in real diplomacy.
I would hasten to disagree with you slightly there, George. Well, maybe it's not yet have materialized, but I think the Europeans are engaging Russia. I mean, Macron has been very vocal about threatening the use of the bazooka. I know that's in regard to the tariffs and Trump, but there has been a growing emphasis of standing up to Putin. And I think it was Andrea Costa just yesterday was talking about we need to talk to Moscow. I mean, aside from whether that's about...
That's a sign that they're just starting to talk about.
Perhaps. I mean, the discussion about this has been for years. You know, I'm a pragmatist in that I don't think Russia's going anywhere. And this idea that sort of somehow you can hold peace talks or summits without the Russians there is bizarre. Not because I sort of want to legitimize Vladimir Putin, but because the core stakeholder along with the Ukrainians. So it's all well and good for the EPC or European political community as they held last year, a conference in France somewhere. Russia's not there.
Yeah.
Well, then we've declared a comprehensive framework for a peace agreement. No, you haven't. The core signatory isn't there. And again, this isn't a sort of a sort of an endorsement of Putin, but it's the reality of the situation. So my point being is that I think, do you think the Europeans are moving in that direction towards engaging the Russians?
I think they're moving in that direction. Yes, but the fact that they're just now talking about talking tells you that this is an area where they have not been heretofore really willing to talk to the Russians. They were quite comfortable with the notion that we could isolate and punish Russia. Essentially tell the Russians they were persona non grata in the civilized world. That didn't work. That did not resolve the war with Ukraine. And the Russians, although they were not welcome for many years in the West or Japan, there were vast portions of the world where the Russians continued to have more or less normal relations and normal diplomatic interaction. So that approach of not talking to the Russians, of shaming them and isolating them really didn't work. So there needs to be a new approach.
Yeah, I think it's just silly. Some of the hardliners are so adamant about no engagement whatsoever. just because out of principle. But that's not how engagements work. That's not how diplomacy works. And to your point about using hard and soft power, right? Joseph Nye emphasized the idea of smart power. And I think that the Europeans are well placed to sort of leverage such an approach more in some ways than the Trump administration are with America, and more than China does. China's improving its soft power. I think it's getting a lot better. I'm actually making a video over the next couple of days about China's relationship to the US and Iran. But I guess sort of as we maybe wind this up for another session with you, maybe we can focus just on Ukraine and then maybe another just on Iran or something like that. I think it'd be great to have you back for a sort of a mini series as such. Where do you see this going, particularly in the context of Ukraine and Russia and the United States? What do you think the reality of that is? Russia's economy isn't good. Putin is in a bad situation right now, but it still doesn't mean that Russia can't be taken seriously or has to be considered, right?
Right. Well, I think part of Europe being strong and part of establishing a balance of power and equilibrium among the great powers is finding a compromise settlement to the war in Ukraine. There's not going to be an unconditional victory on the part of either side, which both had hoped for. I think Putin had hoped that he could, early in the war, simply take the Ukrainian capital and force the terms of surrender on the Ukrainian government. That very quickly proved a mistaken hope on his part. I think then there was hope that the Ukrainians could essentially force Russia into surrender. I think that hope went away with the failed so-called counteroffensive in the summer of 2023. We're now in a position where the two sides are really jockeying for advantage over the terms of a deal. What does the compromise look like? And there has to be a compromise. Both sides are going to have to come away with some things that they can point to that says, hey, look, we've achieved something here. I think for the Russians, the big things that they need here are the end to NATO's enlargement to the east, something that they've been unhappy about since the early 90s. And that unhappiness reached acute levels in recent years. They can't have a situation where NATO or NATO members are stationing military forces or facilities on Ukrainian territory at the end of this war either. So if they can check those two boxes, I think those are significant geopolitical achievements for Putin. I think the Ukrainians need to be able to say, guess what? We fought off the Russian invasion and we have come out of this as an independent state, as a sovereign state. We are no longer under Russia's imperial thumb and we will not be. That is now forever decided. And the terms of this deal will make clear that Ukraine is not going to be a part of Russia's imperium. The other thing that I think the Ukrainians need is something that the Russians have indicated publicly they're willing to agree to, and that is Ukraine's future accession to the European Union. Now, that is going to be a long process, I'm sure, a difficult one. I don't think it's going to happen quickly, but coming away with Russia's explicit acceptance that that is an outcome that Russia can live with is a major accomplishment, I think it will be for Ukraine. The other things about this deal, how large a military might Ukraine have, holdings within the military, who controls what territory. I think although there's an awful lot of attention that's being paid to those things, those aren't going to be the fundamental foundations of a deal. Those are going to be optics issues, things that might have symbolic political significance, but I think those can be managed. Now, the prospects for reaching that kind of compromise are affected by all kinds of things, one of which is how much clout does Donald Trump have? How much political capital does he have in the United States and in the world to use to try to drive this situation toward a final settlement? And that's where the Iran situation comes in. I think he's made a strategic mistake in how he's tried to handle the challenges posed by Iran. I think he knows that now. I think he's trying to find a way out of this situation. The longer this goes on, the worse that war gets. The more political capital he will have expended, the less he will have to expend in Washington in building support for a compromise end to the war in Ukraine. The more the less political clout it looks like he has, the more the Ukrainians and the Europeans will be tempted to play for time here, hoping that some future White House leader, some future constellation of power within Washington will be more advantageous to them and they can get slightly better terms to this deal. And the more Trump looks like he's on the ropes politically, the less confident Russia is going to be that he can actually normalize the US-Russian relationship, which is another goal, I think, that Putin has. I think Putin recognizes that largely due to his own goal in launching this invasion of Ukraine, he has made Russia uncomfortably dependent on China. And so long as this war continues, so long as there is some permanent state of hostility between Russia and the West and a lack of normal relations with the United States, Putin is going to be a dependent junior partner to Xi. And Russia will have very little room for maneuver and very little bargaining leverage in dealing with the Chinese in a situation where he really has no viable relations with the West. And I think he wants to get out of that geopolitically. He doesn't want hostile relations with China. He doesn't want to throw his lot in exclusively with the United States. He wants enough flexibility to have room for maneuver and tack back and forth. And so if he thinks that Trump can't actually prevail over all of the people in Washington that hate the idea of normalized relations with Russia, then he has less incentive to compromise. Mm-hmm. With Ukraine and with Europe, and more incentive to take some steps on the battlefield to basically achieve Russia's goals by other means.
It certainly does, and that's quite a lot of food for thought there, George. But been an absolute pleasure, I think, having you on finally. I appreciate your nuanced takes and a good back and forth over the world order, the state of global affairs. And thank you very much, George Beebe of the Quincy Institute. Everyone for watching. Don't forget to give the video a like. Do subscribe if you want to see more conversations like this. And of course, check out George's writings and work over at the Quincy Institute as well. But we'll see you all next time. Take care.